Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and today we are taking a look at a scenario from Binkov's Battlegrounds. Could a Marine platoon defeat a whole Roman legion? And we are going to be bringing in some additional insight, right? Asking the questions when you peel back the layers, not just force on force, but logistics, strategies, tactics, command and control, all dimensions that we are going to bring in to really try to understand if this Marine platoon is going to come out on top. Let's get into it.
Cumulative what-if battle is before us.
Was listening to my previous video on high speed. Nobody needs that. Let's do a normal speed.
The rifle platoon of US Marines defeat a whole Roman Empire legion. That's 43 soldiers with rifles and fancy modern equipment against over 5,000 men with swords and spears. Roman legion is not only a much bigger unit, sized between a modern-day brigade and a division.
Yeah, that's about right. 5,000 is just spot on.
But is a unit with own logistics. And this clash of historic numbers versus modern tactical unit, who would come out on top?
Da, 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 da.
What do tanks have to do with Roman legion?
Okay, sorry. This is
one of fair set.
Sorry, I don't include the sponsored part of the videos. You should check out the source video itself, of course. But as a general rule, just in case their sponsor doesn't want to be associated with my channel, I skip by it.
Short reach of Roman weapons would not suit the Romans unless the two sides start very close to one another. Flat terrain without cover might again suit the Marines, as they could get clear shots over long distances. Or are there forests abound? In such conditions, Marines may not be able to see farther than a few dozen yards,
Yeah, this is a good point, right? You can mitigate a lot about tactical advantages that you or your opponent have by getting to choose the time and place of the fight. This is obviously not an option for a lot of combat, but if you can, the advantages can be tremendous.
Depending on the density of the foliage. Is the climate very cold or very hot? Either might be problematic for the Marine platoon, as it is a small tactical unit, not designed to operate independently for many days. Platoons carry small rations of food and water, enough for barely a few days.
Yeah, that probably is even being generous. A typical platoon, a light infantry platoon, is only going to bring literally what they can carry on their backs, in addition to all their other tactical gear. And so the general rule would be something like 3 MREs. So you could probably sustain yourself maybe for 3 days, but by that third day, performance is really going to be impacted if you're talking about 1 MRE per day. Water is going to be another tremendous issue. Most light infantry units aren't issued water purification in any form, no chlorine tablets, no iodine, no water filters. So the only water you have is what came with you, which can be sometimes very, very little as a Camelback, maybe 64 ounces. That's enough for about a day before you start running into dangers of heat stroke. You also have to remember, modern light infantry, we carry very heavy gear, and that means that you're going to burn your water much quicker. So we're talking about a total length of fight time of maybe a couple of, maybe at most, I would say 3 days. Again, you know, while they're not trained to do it, an infantry platoon may be able to do things like find a water source and boil water, but that takes a lot of time, effort, and energy.
Exact size of a legion is not a clear-cut number. Some estimates are held in higher regard than others though, so Binkov will go with this. Roughly 4,800 to 5,120 soldiers, roughly 150 more officers, additional 120 scouts and messengers on horses, between 60-ish and several hundred artillery weapon specialists, and upward of 1,000 additional supply-trained personnel, civilians on pay and slaves, some of which had spears and were tasked with aiding in the protection of the supply train. That's what would constitute a core legion, circa.
So, okay, I am going to point this out, that it doesn't seem very fair to sit there and go, hey, we're going to give the Roman legion its fighting men plus its entire logistics system, whereas The platoon doesn't. The platoon also has a logistical tail, though it's not organized in the Roman way, right? Romans, obviously, the legion itself is an almost entirely independent fighting unit, sort of like a modern brigade combat team, whose entire logistical tail, or 85% of its logistical tail, is included in the BCT itself. In this instance, the logistical tail of a platoon is actually outside of its chain of command. And this sort of makes sense, right? You want a commander who's focused on the mission, while someone else at a different echelon in different units is focused on supply and logistics management. So what would be more appropriate was to sit there and say, hey, you have a platoon of, let's say, 34 Marines or 50 Marines, and you also have a robust supply chain of another 50 Marines who handle things like food, water, medical care, pay personnel, maintenance of gear and equipment. So a better analogy would be, again, 100 to this 50.
2nd or 3rd century AD. In actual wars, legions were almost always supported by auxilia troops. Those would mostly be local bred units, which were usually the main source of attack cavalry and ranged units. With all those, actual legion and its accompanying auxilia was at times known to reach 11,000 personnel. For simplicity's sake, those auxilia units will not be accounted for, as they were not core part of a legion. But at the same time, the Marines will not get anything that's not organic part of their rifle platoon. So even though the higher units such as the Marine Battalion would in actual wars give detachments of heavier weapon units to fight alongside the platoon, or an engineering team with landmines, here the platoon will be all by itself, giving...
Right, and it's also worth noting that, yes, he discusses, let's look at his breakdown and we'll explain what exactly this entails. 43 soldiers in a rifle platoon, right? The headquarters is 4 soldiers. That's usually a platoon leader, or in the Marines' case, they call them platoon commanders, a platoon sergeant, and 2 RTOs, right? They're radio telephone operators, a designated sort of command assistant. Then, of course, you have the 3 rifle squads, 13 soldiers each, which I believe is a squad leader plus 4 fire teams, or a squad leader with their fire team. It depends. It can get a little weird. I don't actually know that much about exactly how Marine light infantry squads are organized. In the U.S., the classic squad is a 12-soldier squad with 3 3-man teams. Is that right? 2 5-man teams? I can only know MPs. MPs are going to be... I mean, this isn't a helpful analogy, but your squad leader has two team members, right? Each of your 3 teams are a team lead and 2 team members, an automatic rifleman, or someone with a saw and a M203. Usually our team leads would have the M203, but every platoon's a little bit different. And the truth is, even though this is doctrinally what they have, reality always gets a vote. You're sometimes going to have a soldier or a Marine in this case, right? Someone's going to be on leave, someone's going to be plussed up, there's always going to be a plus or minus of a couple of soldiers just because of the natural ebb and flow of personnel.
Here the platoon will be all by itself. Giving Marines vehicles would also not make the scenario interesting, as the Marines could just spend all the ammo the vehicles have, causing numerous casualties, then disengage, moving hundreds of miles within a day if needed. If both sides don't know who their enemy is, but get orders to find them and hunt them down, Marines should fare better. While they may be surprised at first to see a Roman legion, Romans are a known quantity for them. But Romans seeing Marines would be in a hell of a surprise once the rifles start firing and their comrades start dying hundreds of yards away from the enemy.
Yeah, this is what we talk about, information asymmetry. And this is why real militaries, were real militaries, but why militaries so jealously guard their secret information. And that's because in a decisive engagement like this, if you have a technological or tactical or informational advantage over your opponent, it can completely change the dynamic of a fight. Something that might have been a competitive battle with proper preparation time instead becomes a one-sided massacre because one side simply doesn't have the tactics necessary to counter technological innovation. Remember, there's a technological change in the battlefield, and then the tactics evolve to stop it. This is why U.S. forces, right, dramatically changed their convoy operations only after the advent of IEDs in Iraq, right? It was the IED threat emerged, then tactics began to change, driving slower, spacing out vehicles, having a higher combat posture, right? And as the IED threat evolved, so did the tactics. But the tactics, they call them TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures to counter those threats are always going to be a little behind. So you want to make sure that you don't let your opponent get the drop on your new technology so that they can pre-develop tactics that they think will work against them.
Faced against something new to them, loud and frightening, almost magic-like bullets and explosions, the Romans are very unlikely to remain coherent as a unit. The Romans are much more likely to quickly start fleeing and eventually disintegrate as an organized opponent. So to make things a bit more even, let us assume that Romans also have some knowledge of their enemy from before. Perhaps some other Roman units captured a few other Marines earlier and have gotten to inspect their weapons.
Okay, the puppet's just a great touch.
And gear. Even though they may not fully understand how they work, they're likely to learn of what such weapons and gear are capable of. So then a Roman legion is dispatched to try and kill a known enemy unit, perhaps in an effort to seize even more of their almost godlike weapons and equipment. At the same time, the Marines know some of their comrades have been captured and that there is likely a whole legion out there looking for them. Do they flee or do they engage?
Right, so here's a good example of what we talked about just how little gear Marines carry with them relative to the battlefield. Yes, you're like, wow, these guys have a lot on them, and it's sort of true. But look, magazines, this is going to be things like radios, a tent, sleeping bags, right? This is not just food and water in here. This is their night vision devices. This is, it changes spare batteries. If they're a mortar team, it's going to be mortars. There's just so much here. And the truth is, moving under this load is extremely physically intensive.
The whole legion out there, the enemy does have some horses. Those are not numerous and aren't a threat on their own. Let us remember, the 120 or so horseback riders the legion has are not primarily a combat force. While they have swords for self-defense, they're mostly scouts and messengers. Even if Romans gave them spears, neither the horses nor riders are accustomed to charges onto enemies. If Romans still try to press on with a cavalry charge, those 120 riders would likely be slaughtered. They would be spotted from afar, raising up dust and being larger targets than an average human. And then concentrated fire would whittle down their numbers until the attack falls apart. Even if the riders don't change their mind and don't flee upon seeing half of their comrades killed, the horses are likely to just go wild when 40mm grenades start landing left and right to them. Grenadiers could deliver precision.
The other thing that's worth remembering is that a small tactical unit of Marines, they're going to be able to use cover, concealment, and camouflage so much better than a Roman legion, right? These cavalry scouts, they are looking for other enemy formations. The fact is that 50 enemy would maybe just be the bare minimum thing that would qualify as being worth reporting. Instead, right, they're designed to be looking for large formations, things that are an actual threat to the legion. The fact is that in Roman times, a 50-person unit could not deal that much damage on their own to a legion. So it wasn't a big concern that they were there. They would only be relevant if the scouts found this 50-person unit and said, hey, we think they're a vanguard of the larger army that we're really looking for. The whole point of this that I'm getting at is that the scouts would also lose a lot of their effectiveness against a modern infantry platoon who is really capable of camouflage, cover, and concealment in establishing fighting positions.
Precision fire to 150 meters and reach area-sized targets up to 350 meters away. It's highly unlikely a single horseback rider would actually reach the Marines, unless they manage to sneak up to them. Marines could start firing from several hundred yards away. First the marksmen with better rifles and scopes. Then from 300 to 400 yards away, the rest of the Marines could fire with sufficient.
Yeah, so that's going to be 3. It says an M38. I'm not familiar with the M38, but again, I know there've been a lot of changes to small arms weapons since I left active duty. M38 may just be one of those semi-automatic DMR, designated marksman rifles. And yeah, 600 yards is about the max. You can actually take an M4 out to 600 yards with the right optic, but the accuracy is going to have a pretty big hit.
Accuracy. Sure, a lot of those would be misses at such distances, but as legionaries get closer, accuracy would improve. Starting from, say, 400 yards away and running at an average of 15 seconds per 100 yards, Romans are likely to be exposed for some 60 seconds. Marines could run away to keep the distance, but if they do that, they can't shoot. So unless they're running to get to a better defensive position, they're likely to stay put and just lay prone to improve their aim. How accurate can soldiers be with today's...
Right. One of the things that, again, we're sort of hand-waving away the position selection of this fight. As they've discussed, in this scenario, he seems to be describing a Roman legion that is on the hunt for Marines. Marines are on the defensive, and the Roman legion is on offense. This is a non-trivial factor because if the Roman legion is in pursuit, then the Marines, as the defenders, get to choose, in some ways, their time and place of the fight. Again, not universally, right? If you're being pursued by forces on horseback, you may not be able to cover the distances that you need, but you are at least not going to run the risk of, say, having the Roman legion show up in the armored personnel carriers. So the Marines will engage in some site selection. What's an optimal site selection if you know you're fighting a legion? Well, you want it to be somewhere where you have an avenue of exit, right? You have 2 ways to at least exit this defensive position. You want your enemy to have limited avenues of approach. So you wouldn't want to, for example, try to fight them on a hilltop where at some point they could sit there and get outside of sight, sound, and small arms range and just wait for you to starve to death. That is a very common Roman tactic. So instead, the Marines are going to want to find somewhere that, for example, maybe a mountain pass or an area between 2 large impassable swamps, and set there and wait for the Roman legion to approach, right? And then where they're going to have to be canalized, that's going to be where the fight takes place. And then when the Marines decide it's time to retreat, they'll be able to retreat.
These rifles and scopes.
Another ideal use is the use of natural or man-made obstacles. Obstacles are things that will reduce or change the enemy's ability to maneuver. So again, as we talked about, if you could fight the Roman legion in, say, a swamp, right, where the legion won't be able to run towards you as your Marine platoon, instead they'll have to slowly slog through, right? It's going to make it much easier to engage them with small arms fire, especially in a swamp because you can't get into the prone. Your head will be submerged. So you'll have no choice but to stand there as a full-size target. You could simulate this sort of effect using concertina wire, something that many Marine platoons might have access to. Concertina wire would just be strewn across major choke points, and either it'll force the legion to stop, turn, and go through smaller engagement areas, or it could also literally slow them down as they tried to stumble and push through this wire.
Here are results of some recent testing. Bench results are mechanical limits of the weapon, basically taking the soldier out of the accuracy equation. Qualification is what average soldier can achieve in shooting trials, when he has a fair amount of time to take a steady aim, and when he's not under threat or stress. Combat stress results are from simulated combat conditions, and the accuracy drops quite a bit. Important to note, those simulations include soldiers being shot at, so stress levels are likely higher than what a soldier shooting from 300 yards away.
Okay, so I want to point this out. A soldier, and he's referring this, he may actually be correct, because a soldier, this is a study by the U.S. Army, so the people shooting here are actually soldiers, but he's using soldier and Marine interchangeably. In U.S. military parlance, they are not. A Marine is considered separate, sort of like how you would never call the service member that works on ships A soldier, you would call them a sailor because that is a distinct role in the military. Similarly, Marines do not view themselves as sailors, nor do they view themselves as soldiers, right? They view themselves as their own category, Marine. So you'll hear some people say soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, right? And Air Force personnel refer to themselves as airmen.
The way at a guy with a sword would be 300-yard results against Romans would plausibly be somewhere in between of qualification and combat stress results. As Romans get closer, under 100 yards away, a mass of guys with swords running towards the Marines would likely lead to stress levels comparable to ones from the simulation. To sum it up, marksmen at up to 500 yards away would probably be aiming at targets standing out, like ballista crews, officers and horse riders, and might achieve 20 to 25% hit rates against stationary targets. Let's try to crunch some numbers. Each of the
Right. And this is something else that's really worth talking about, is that in the modern US military, there is an expectation that actually taking out leaders is not terribly effective. And that's because soldiers and, well, light infantry are generally expected to have a really robust understanding of the mission. So our soldiers are something, or again, I'm using soldiers, they're talking about Marines, service members are provided a lot of direction and expected to have a really strong understanding of the situation that they're operating in. They're expected to know the so what of why they're doing something. And the idea is that good leadership, tactical units can almost function like wind-up toys, right? You provide them with information, you provide them with a plan and a good mission brief, and then you set them out and they run through the mission that you've described. Now, obviously, there's no substitute for leadership. There's all sorts of things that can happen on mission that change things and require leaders' intervention to solve. But the idea is that if for some reason that leader became incapacitated, that the soldiers and the subordinate leaders would not only be able to run the mission as planned, but be able to make independent decisions about changes on the ground because those lower level soldiers still understand the larger strategic picture. So for example, if they said, hey, we want you to seize this objective, this listening post, so that the enemy can't detect our signals. Well, maybe if things change and you can't seize the listening post, and your platoon leader, your platoon sergeant, your squad leader is dead, a team lead may still know, hey, we can still achieve our objective if we just destroy the listening post equipment. Maybe we lob a couple 203s into it and we boogie out of here. We could still achieve the strategic objective. But that sort of thinking is something that it's taken our military a long time to achieve. And it requires developing these NCO corps. It requires a totally different way of training and educating not just your early stage troops, but your mid-career NCOs, junior officers, mid-level officers. It's a whole cultural shift. And we see even the Russian military doesn't really have this, right? The modern Russian military, they freeze up when their officers don't give them orders. So taking out officers in a Roman legion might have a tremendously worse effect than just taking out the officers of the Marine platoon. So it's possible that with the death of enough officers who give commands, that could shut down the entire offensive, right? Other units that need to be queued up to execute might not be able to. So, and it's probably pretty rare because again, long-range engagements are not something the Romans had to deal with. The odds that one of their commanders would be killed before the legion ever entered the engagement was almost inconceivable. So it could be incredibly off-putting to see their commanders taken out like that before the engagement's begun.
3 marksmen could hit 1 legionary every 5 or so seconds at 500 or so yards. At 300 yards, each of the 34 gun-firing Marines could need a second or two to successfully hit a Roman, followed by a second or two more to pick a new Roman target. Marines firing at 200 yards would hit targets a bit more often. At 100 yards, combat stress would start becoming a big factor, but the weapon system precision overcomes it and overall accuracy still increases. 60-something seconds would be needed to cover the 400 yards, so
that's again assuming a flat terrain with no obstacles. And these Marines on the defensive, they're going to understand that obstacles are absolutely essential to making this happen. If they have the time, if they have even 2 or 3 hours, they're going to be in a much better position to emplace obstacles, to force their enemy to be canalized, to force them to turn and weave around all sorts of obstacles that they've created, even just silly things like a stack of wood, for example, that they have to stop, turn, and go around is going to buy them a lot of extra time. Again, think about it logically. 400 yards straight shot or 400 yards zigging and zagging, totally different equation.
Here's a table of Romans shot by the time they cover a certain distance. At 50 yards or less, Marines' accuracy could get very high, possibly killing a Roman with almost every bullet, every 1 or 2 seconds or so, if the soldiers could remain cool-headed. Notice the video mentions 34 gun-firing Marines. That's because there are 9 Grenadiers in the platoon. Instead of shooting their rifles, they could shoot a 40mm grenade every 10 seconds.
This is true, at least when I was deployed, that I didn't put any sort of limit on the amount of grenades carried. Again, we talk a little bit about prep time. Would they carry, say, a smoke grenade? Probably not, right? They probably shouldn't use smoke or flash grenades, but sometimes that number of grenades can be offset, right? You'd have maybe 4 30 HEDP rounds, high explosive dual purpose, but you would also want to see them carry at least some other rounds of smoke, a flare round often, or an illume round. So there's all sorts of non-lethal rounds that are an option here.
Hitting a ballista-sized target from 150 meters away or lobbing a grenade into a wider area from 350 meters away. Grenades can be deadly if they land in an area with lots of enemies. Still, they pack little explosive filler and produce a limited number of fragments. The farther a person is from their detonation point, the more likely it is they will not get hit by fragments. How would the Romans even be positioned? Being in a very tight formation is not good, not only for surviving grenades, but it would also offer their enemy a dense forest of bodies, meaning Marines could afford to just lay down automatic fire and be fairly certain most bullets would hit something. At several meters between each Roman soldier, individual aim for rifles becomes important. Semi-automatic fire would get preferred to automatic one, which would waste too many bullets into empty spaces. If Romans are advancing in lines, say 2 meters between each of them, and a dozen meters between lines, several might be killed outright by each 40mm grenade, with several more neutralized due to wounds. Grenadiers are more limited with time than with number of grenades they carry, as Romans could cover those 400 yards in roughly a minute.
Again, 400 yards in a minute, maybe on a track. It's not going to be like this. There's also from my understanding, the Roman legionnaires were marched at an extremely fixed pace. That was part of how they ensured that they stayed in formation, much like the British military or the early, in the era of muskets, you had to march in formation because that's how the shield wall functions. And as we talked about, if you're not able to evolve your tactics in response to new technology, then you're going to always lose to that technological superiority. I don't think you'd be able to retrain a Roman legion to march in a fundamentally different way, especially to operate at a dead sprint, which is what he's describing, right? 400 meters would take probably 5 to 10 minutes to cover at a Roman marching pace.
During that time, each grenadier could fire roughly 6 grenades and neutralize some 60 or so Romans. Also, when and if Romans get to some 40 yards or so of the Marines, another option opens up for the Marines: hand grenades. Most soldiers don't carry many of them though, but they are a bit deadlier than 40mm grenade. Still, we might be looking at 100 or more hand grenades thrown, with a lot of casualties on the Roman side. At 20 or so yards away, Romans could use their pilums, spears that they usually threw just before charging onto their enemies with swords. If hundreds of Romans were still around, a rain of spears could present quite a threat to the Marines, if for nothing else than because of the psychological factor. But it's unlikely pilums would even be carried.
Yeah, it's also unlikely that the Marines, again, assuming they have time to set a defensive position, they're going to be digging foxholes, and a big part of foxholes is cover. So you're going to have broken tree branches or other locally available cover over top this foxhole, right? That's where the Marines are going to be. Again, is a foxhole optimized to fight Roman legionnaires? Sort of, I would argue, right? It's going to create a box that surrounds you that you can't be stabbed. It's going to be a one-person bunker, right, as a final redoubt, and that could actually be extremely useful. Because as we've talked about, the secret to victory anytime you're the subordinate force is going to be canalization, forcing your enemy to reduce the area available to them in which they can maneuver. Once you've done that, then you can concentrate your fire on them. We talk about the hand grenades, and again, if you can effectively canalize your enemy, those hand grenades can become booby traps. I'm assuming the Geneva Conventions don't apply here, but simple tripwire grenades would be devastating to the Roman legion. And again, if they realize that's what was happening, they would have to be slowed down incredibly as they check every step for grenade wire.
By Romans. To get an answer why, we need to go way back to when the battle is planned for. If Romans get to know some basic information about the capabilities of their enemy, they would come to the conclusion they would suffer huge casualties. So if they still press on with the attack, they would need to plan it accordingly. Usual tight Roman formations would be useless. It would only make them better targets for US automatic fire. For grenades, not so much actually, as bodies first to be in line of incoming fragments would protect most of the bodies behind. So the soldiers would need to lose most of their equipment to make them able to run fairly fast for over 400 yards.
Again, okay, so this is sort of an apples to oranges. With a lot of prep time, the Marines will become even more lethal because of their ability to conduct terrain analysis. Again, in contrast, the Roman legion, right, with more prep time will definitely come in possibly with an innovative strategy, though again, like we talked about, rigid thinking among command is very, very, very common. So you may see the Romans come in with a more effective strategy, but it will be offset by the fact that the Marines will be able to canalize their enemy, create obstacles to force them into unfavorable terrain. The Marines, because the Legion is in pursuit, the Marines will get to choose the time and place of the fight. For example, they may actually choose to engage in the dusk, right? They may set a defensive position only in the afternoon, right? So that by the time the Roman legion catches up, they are going to lose their daylight before the engagement ever begins, right? So that the Marines, of course, who have night vision can withdraw and move on, and the Roman legion will be stuck blind in the dark.
Which is why they would most likely be ordered to carry only their swords. Running with a large shield and a long spear is too cumbersome. In theory, all the casualties mentioned up until now, while steep, still allow Romans enough survivors to slaughter the Marines with swords. But would that actually happen? Almost certainly not.
Yeah, so it talks about the idea that 2,400 to 3,000 are going to be dead or seriously wounded, but you don't need to reach that number, right? You just need to achieve almost any wounding and to eliminate the combat effectiveness of a troop. So a wound to the shoulder, to the leg, it doesn't take much, right?
The main reason is human psychology. Let's say the Roman legion to face the Marines is handpicked for their loyalty, bravery, etc. They may be told what to expect, they may even be told about explosion that will kill a dozen of them at once, but once they actually start charging and see their friends die at an alarmingly fast rate, they will fall apart as a unit. They will get scared, and as soon as they see some larger groups of their fellow soldiers running away, they will say screw this and turn away as well. Romans would get routed before they reach the Marines in such a fight, out in the open. There is simply no historical precedent for an event where an army unit loses roughly half of its force and still keeps charging.
Right. This talks about British riflemen versus the Zulu, right? Zulu spearmen attacking British riflemen around, I think it was the late 1800s. Zulu took 850 casualties and disengaged after 10% of their force was killed, another 10% wounded. And it's especially to be unable to touch the enemy while they touch you, it's just too terrifying.
In ancient Roman battles, The winning side had usually 10 to 20% of dead and wounded. The losing side would have a bit more dead, up until a point where they broke apart and started to flee. That's where steep additional casualties often came in, especially if the winner had a cavalry to pursue those fleeing soldiers. So, if Romans could be robots without fear, then yeah, they could win. But realistically, they could withstand perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 casualties before their ranks break up and a mass rout begins. There are additional issues for Romans. Having formations where there's 2-meter distance between two legionaries in a line is very hard to achieve and upkeep in a battle. To get the most out of the charge, all Romans would need to be in a single line. But that's not possible. That would call for a line that's over 10...
Right, this is what we talked about. Yes, if you were fully... if you were on full open terrain, then yes, you could, like, in theory, maneuver and encircle the Marines and push forward in a shrinking circle. That may be the most effective way, but again, the Marines also have choice here.
...kilometers long. One needs to organize that line first and then keep it oriented towards the enemy, who needs to be stupid enough to just let the Romans waste hours on organizing such a formation. Furthermore, edges of the line would need to advance first, and middle of the line would need to wait. It all calls for precise organization that's extremely unlikely over such distances and running speeds required. Most likely the whole line would just dissolve into a huge mass of people running somewhere, most of them not even knowing where, as they would not see their enemy.
Yep, this is the other problem, is that the Romans, it's hard to see, and Marine units are going to be camouflaged. It's going to be hard to tease out, especially over great distances, where these Marines are precisely.
Having several lines would be better. While that means not all Romans would be reaching the Marines at once, and more time would be given to the Marines to shoot, in practice it would make the whole formation more manageable. Still, having even 5 lines would make each line 2 kilometers long. Perhaps even borderline manageable with various signals and cavalry messengers, but depending on the exact terrain, still way too cumbersome. Realistically, Marines would simply run away before Romans get organized. Ideally, and what would solve most of Roman problems, would be an ambush. To somehow get the Marines to walk into an area where Romans already encircled them. But that's extremely implausible, unless Marines believe no threat exists in their surroundings.
I mean, it's not that implausible, but again, we run into this problem where an ambush at extremely close distances is incredibly tough to achieve, and you're going to have to rely on camouflage, cover and concealment, something that the Romans just weren't trained to do. They fight in formations. There was no precedent for camouflage at like what we're talking about, and that would be essential to getting this extreme close range ambush.
Also, while there are terrains that might suit Romans better, such as the woods, it's unlikely that Marines would get themselves into such a situation. Once they know they're under threat, they might seek clear terrain without obstacles.
They would seek clear terrain with obstacles. Anything that's going to slow the Romans down, as long as they have reconned the area and they know how they're going to retreat.
Romans would have their cavalry scouts, with which they could cover more ground while seeking the Marines. But Romans lack optics the Marines have. Marines could spot a horse rider from over a mile away, a few times greater distance than what the Romans would enjoy. Then there's the issue of nighttime. The fact Marines are more mobile as a unit would dictate when engagements could take place. And since every Marine in the platoon does have night vision goggles, it means the Marines could actually be the ones attacking the Legion.
Now, okay, there's a little bit of an issue that we're getting into here. So the Marines are on it, both the Marines and I think the Legion should be on a ticking clock logistically. And the idea, of course, like we talked about, is that they have about a day before they need more water. So if your goal is to ambush the Marines, one option would be to just find every water source and camp out there and ambush the Marines when they go for water. The other option that is worth noting is that the Marines would have to know that they have to achieve victory over the Legion in order to get food, right? In order to eat. So the Marines, in some ways, may be actually the ones on the attack because they are more likely to run out of food faster, where the Romans in this scenario have a significant logistical tail. You know, exhausted, starving Marines, it doesn't matter that they have a technological advantage if you can starve them out without water or food for days or even weeks.
They could roughly track the location of the Roman legion during the day, then send out scouts to pinpoint the location during nighttime, and then perform raids during nighttime, using sniper shots from afar and lobbing grenades from a few hundred yards away.
And that would actually be effective, possibly as a way to get resources, right? Literally raiding Roman supply convoys and grain stores, taking the food, and disappearing again.
Concentration of Roman soldiers. Such attacks, especially if done over a few consecutive nights, would have grave impact on Roman morale.
Also, if you attack their supply lines, right, the Roman legion, as hard as it is for the Marines to sustain themselves, the Roman legion with 5,000 stomachs is going to require a massive amount of food, and even disruptions of, say, cutting 50% of their food trains are going to make a massive, massive impact on their combat effectiveness. Their options will either be to turn their pack mules and horses into food, or to just simply starve or divert more of their combat power into securing their supply chains, meaning that their actual attack force is going to be greatly, greatly reduced. And the fact is that maybe this is actually the winning strategy, is for the Marines to fight their legion and take advantage of their superior mobility, their superior command and control, and engage in quick strikes, focusing on the Roman legion's logistical train that will force that legion to starve, even as the Marine platoon is able to get more and more food and water.
As Romans could simply not see who is attacking them. They could at best deduce the direction the gunfire comes from, but during nighttime, trying to organize a large formation to go into that pitch black would be impossible. It is thus likely the Roman legion would fall apart within days under such raids from the Marine platoon, and its legionaries would simply desert. Various tactical shenanigans the Romans could try mostly require daytime to work. They could try and bring the cavalry behind the Marines as the Roman lines are charging the front, but while it would mean more bullets spent and a bit more panic, end result would still likely be the Romans breaking lines and routing before they reach the Marines. Romans could burn vegetation, both to box in the Marines and cover own movements, but the Marines would be able to simply run away from a wildfire and choose not to go into dangerous areas. Marines' only real limitation would be the food and
Yeah, we were never issued water purification tablets, and I don't think they come in MREs.
water. In a very inhospitable environment, such as a desert, they may die of thirst first, as Roman unit carries more water per person. Even if they kill half the Romans first, the remaining half may declare themselves victors if they remain to live longer. But those are extremely specific situations. In most other situations, the Marine platoon comes out on top. They could perhaps even deal with better part of 2 Roman legions before reaching their limits, which would be dictated by the number of bullets carried. These figures are quite relative though, as Marines would carry as many rounds as they think they might need. If they got whisked away into the Roman times while on some boring patrol, they might carry less. If someone told them they're to fight a Roman legion up front so they get a chance to stock up, they might double the number of bullets carried. Bottom line is, swords and spears are unlikely to defeat modern night vision, optics, rifles and grenades.
I love this cheesy victory.
At least not with these ratio of numbers. Oh, and before you go, think about subscribing if you like my content.
Yeah, definitely. This is great stuff. Let me know, guys, if you want me to check out more of this. And of course, big thanks to the patrons of Patreon. You guys make this channel possible, and I really appreciate it. Wait, let's give them a quick shout out before we go. Thanks to everybody. There's too many to name, but you guys make this channel possible. Thanks again. Be sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.